Hello, boys and girls, and welcome to a lesson on eutrophication. Bum, bum, bum. A slow death. That's right, I just added a sound effect. Deal with it. I want you to imagine that you are going on your day to day activities, doing living your life, when you start to realize it's getting more and more difficult to breathe. And eventually, it gets so difficult to breathe that you end up dead from asphyxiation, which is a type of suffocation. And then, when your ghost rises from your grave, you will still have no idea how you died in the first place. This is what it feels like to be a victim of eutrophication. Eutrophication is a nasty process that can lead to the destruction of entire freshwater ecosystems. We're talking lakes, dams, rivers, and wetlands. So what is this eutrophication? I'm going to give you a step-by-step explanation so that you don't lose me as I'm explaining. And at any point, if I'm going too fast, you can pause the video and take note. That's what's nice about, video learning. So step one, firstly, there needs to be an overabundance of nutrients, especially nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. These get into the freshwater body, like the pond, for example, and they dissolve inside the water. And that's the first, the beginning of the end for that water body. So nitrogen and phosphorus are nutrients, and they're also elements in the periodic table of elements, and they both promote plant growth. The next step is, or secondly, what happens is now that there's so much nutrients that promote plants to grow, that plants like algae that are not very fussy plants grow very quickly. So this causes algae, the abundance of nitrogen in the water causes algae to grow very quickly. Then, when the algae grows, since the algae is growing very quickly, it creates a sort of blanket over the surface of the water. Because remember, algae wants sunlight, so it tends to grow on top of the water where the light is the most. But this creates a blanket over the water which blocks the sunlight. As you can see in these areas, there's no more sunlight, which means that any plants in these areas can no longer use photosynthesis to get food, which means those plants will eventually die. And when plants die, and all the dead plant matter in the water attracts bacterial growth. So now that there's lots of food for bacteria, bacteria will chow down and also populate at an alarming rate. So now we have a large amount of bacteria growing in the water. Since bacteria are not photosynthetic, which means they do not produce their own food using sunlight, they also don't produce oxygen as a byproduct, which means they just use up oxygen, similar to how animals do it. And now that there's so many bacteria, they use up more oxygen that can be replaced by plants, because now the plants that were there are now dead. So the oxygen levels in the water plummet down to extremely low levels. Eventually, the oxygen levels are too low to support any life, which means that any living organism like this fish over here will suffocate to death. And that would be the end of that freshwater ecosystem. So that's eutrophication. Now, how does eutrophication happen? Like, what causes it? We know it's because of the overabundance of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus in the water, but how does it get there? Well, eutrophication can happen naturally. But when it happens naturally, it happens over a few hundred years, because if you have a still body of water, over time, since that water's not moving, it collects a lot of nutrients from runoff from the forest area. When it rains, some of the nitrogen in the air from nitrification when lightning hits, that eventually accumulates in the water, and then naturally over time this happens. But this happens over long periods of time. So that's natural eutrophication. Unnatural eutrophication is, of course, caused by human activity. So human influence can cause eutrophication to happen at alarming rates. So not over a few hundred years, but within less than a year, which is extremely bad. So commercial farming is a major culprit of eutrophication. But how? Well, it's because of the fertilizer we use. Tons of fertilizer is used in farms to nourish crops, but fertilizer is rich, of course, in nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Of course it is, because that's what plants need to grow. So we purposely fill our fertilizer with those elements so that plants can grow faster. Problem is, when it rains, the runoff rain, like the stream of water that, when the rain accumulates and then starts to run off, I think it's the fourth process of the water cycle, the fourth stage. That water carries the fertilizer in it downstream, and if there's a wetland or freshwater ecosystem, it will carry the water with the fertilizer into that ecosystem, and then eventually or ultimately cause eutrophication. So there are methods to preventing eutrophication, of course. The first one is obviously to not build your farmlands uphill, so that if there is runoff, it doesn't go into the water. Since you're uphill, water always runs from the highest elevation to the lowest. So if you're not on the highest, or your farm is not on the highest, your water will not carry the water uphill, only down. So firstly, don't build farms uphill near water ecosystems, right? And the second one, which is also very clever, is to dig or build field buffers. So, plant plants or hedges or whatever around your farm area. Alternatively, you can also build water trenches that stops runoff from leaving the farm. And so this is a water trench. It's just basically a ditch that surrounds the farm area, so that when the water runoff leaves from the crops, it gets caught in this trench, and so it doesn't overflow and carry on going, outside the farmland area into potential, rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, etc. So I hope that was helpful, and never stop learning. Until next time, have a good one. Come on.